I'm at San Diego Comic-Con, the nerd mecca of the West. I'm surrounded by an endless, overwhelming display of fandom. And what you'll see more than almost anything else here is Batman. Countless versions of Batman. Comic book Batman and Michael Keaton Batman, and Ben Affleck Batman and Adam West Batman, and the Batman Who Laughs, and Batman Beyond, and Lego Batman. But there's one Batman you never seem to see, that many people would rather forget. For 20 years, Joel Schumacher's Batman movies have been considered cinematic travesties, abominations. In the words of George Clooney, the movies that killed the Batman franchise. But what if I told you that they're not actually that bad? That they've gotten better with time? What if I told you that it's time to give them another shot? We need to remember what the state of comic book movies was in the mid-90s. Between 1978 and 1987, the Superman series had fallen from a glorious blockbuster sensation that invented the modern superhero movie to an embarrassing shadow of its former self. 2 years later, Tim Burton's first Batman movie broke box office records, becoming a pop culture phenomenon. This was followed in 1992 by a sequel, Batman Returns, also a massive success. The thing about the Burton movies is that they're not especially faithful adaptations. They're Batman movies in which Batman kills people left and right and puts guns on the Batmobile. In a baffling, massive departure from the source material, the Joker turns out to be the guy who murdered Bruce Wayne's parents. Catwoman is somehow brought back to life by cats licking her, and the Penguin is a deformed mutant raised by a circus who tries to murder babies in some sort of modern biblical plague. These are not, especially by modern standards, good adaptations of the comics. But what they lacked in fidelity to the source material, they made up for in magnificent visuals, astounding production design, riveting performances, and some of the best music scores the genre has seen. Or heard. I don't know. And when it came to superhero movies, the other options at the time were not great. For some reason I'm never going to understand, after the huge success of the first Batman movie, instead of greenlighting a bunch of other comic book superhero movies, Hollywood studios decided to make films about pulp characters from the 1930s that had been out of print for years, like Dick Tracy and The Shadow. The rare superhero movies that got made were projects like Steel, starring Shaq, or the direct-to-video Captain America movie starring J.D. Salinger's son. Comic book fans would take what they could get, and what they could get were the Burton Batman movies. They might not have been ideal, they may have inexplicably changed core aspects of the character and mythology, but they at least took it seriously and were respected by the mainstream. And then came the Schumacher movies.
I'll get drive-through.
Chicks dig the car.
All right, everyone, chill.
In the mid-90s, nerd culture was at a low point. The comic book boom of the early 90s had collapsed, and the industry was falling apart. Superhero comics were entering a sort of self-parody, and the longtime fans just wanted what they loved to be taken seriously. Instead, what these fans got were movies that harkened back to Batman's goofy, ridiculous Silver Age era and the 1960s Adam West TV series.
Holy rusted metal, Batman! Huh?
That ditched Burton's dark edginess for neon-drenched camp, that included extreme close-ups of Batman and Robin's crotches and butts, that put nipples on the Batsuit. They were silly and childish and transparently designed to sell toys. They were homoerotic. The comic books had become increasingly gritty, dark, and violent over the past decade, and these ran as far in the opposite direction as possible. Right when fans most wanted a serious, respectable Batman movie, they got this instead. So they hated it, especially Batman and Robin, which went so far with the camp and cartoonishness that even mainstream audiences rejected it. For whatever their qualities or problems may have been, they were the wrong Batman movies for their time.
But here's the thing. An argument could be made that Batman and Robin is responsible for the superhero movie boom that has dominated the last 20 years of cinema. With Batman and Robin, we had a clear low point, an example of what people didn't want, a roadmap of what to avoid. So 3 years later, the first X-Men movie made a point of being exactly what the Schumacher Batman movies were not. It dropped any theatricality, any elements of camp or artificiality or comic bookiness. It was grounded and realistic, and straight up mocked the idea of colorful, goofy costumes.
What would you prefer? Yellow spandex?
Then 2 years later, Sam Raimi's Spider-Man, while more colorful than X-Men, still made an important choice that Batman and Robin had not. It was faithful to the comics. It was the Spider-Man fans recognized and wanted to see. It was sincere instead of winking. The pitch for Christopher Nolan's Batman trilogy might as well have been the opposite of the Schumacher movies in every way. This was the first time the character had appeared in live action since 1997, and Warner Brothers was making a promise to the audience. Don't worry, it's not going to be like those other Batman movies. It won't be silly, and it definitely won't be gay. Even the Marvel Cinematic Universe, by far the most hugely successful comic book movie series ever, positioned itself from the beginning in a very un-Schumacher way. As wacky and cosmic and comic booky as they eventually got, they began with a shot of military jeeps in the Afghanistan desert, firmly placing those stories in our world, a world that is realistic and grounded, that take it all seriously. Something I've realized is that for my generation, and for a lot of fans of comic books and comic book movies, the conversation about Joel Schumacher begins and ends with his two Batman movies. This is short-sighted and basically wrong, because Joel Schumacher has made 22 other movies, and most of them don't really resemble the Batman movies at all. If you hear the name Schumacher and say, oh yeah, the rubber nipples guy, you're missing the point. He was part of the crowd of 80s filmmakers making mainstream movies with strong aesthetic choices, kind of like Tony Scott or Adrian Lyne. His movies were drenched in spectacular uses of color, fog, and wind. He had a knack for casting young actors who would immediately become huge stars, like everyone in St. Elmo's Fire, The Lost Boys, or Flatliners. Even after the Batman movies, he's the director that launched Colin Farrell's career. He jumped from melodramas about 20-somethings to vampire horror comedies, to romantic comedies, to John Grisham legal thrillers. The guy made Falling Down. He had range, he was great with actors, could leap from genre to genre, and he was a really exciting, unique visual stylist. He also made back-to-back movies featuring sexy sax men, and now I'm disappointed that we never got a scene where Batman played the saxophone. If you watch Flatliners, not the remake with Ellen Page, the original one, he seems like the perfect guy to take over the Batman series from Tim Burton. It's a gorgeous, inventive, gothic melodrama set at a medical school that looks like a decrepit art museum. Look at this insane apartment where Kiefer Sutherland's character lives. It's dark and theatrical in a similar way to Burton's Batman movies, but cares about the humanity of the characters in a way those films don't. What I'm saying here is that Schumacher is more fun and interesting than he gets credit for. Like, Flatliners kind of rules. Check it out.
Okay, now that I've spent 10 minutes talking about everything but Schumacher's Batman movies, I think it's time to talk about Schumacher's Batman movies. For decades, there's been a ton of talk about how he was ordered to make them lighter and more kid-friendly, and to tailor them more to the demands of the marketing departments and the need to sell toys. And it is true that McDonald's got to review the script for Batman Forever before production, and that there were requests to add some extra vehicles and costumes to Batman and Robin for the sake of manufacturing more action figures. But it is straight up untrue to say that these are not absolutely Schumacher's movies. If you watch this channel, you've probably heard me complain about the homogeneity of modern superhero movies and the lack of strong singular takes by interesting filmmakers. But that is exactly what Schumacher's Batman movies are. Batman Forever is not a radical departure from Burton's films. It's lighter and more colorful, but still takes Batman himself seriously, and tries to probe deeper into his psychology. As in, his love interest is literally a psychologist who tries to probe deeper into his psychology. But we get flashbacks to his childhood and origin story, delivered in Schumacher's classic fog and wind-filled style. Unfortunately, a lot of this subplot was left on the cutting room floor, and it feels like a half measure. Probably the biggest change in Schumacher's approach was bringing the series back to a more classical, old-school comic book notion of heroes and villains, good guys and bad guys, where morality is black and white. The villains aren't misunderstood, damaged outcasts, they're just villains. And the heroes are idealized, both in heroic ideology and physical appearance. Instead of body armor, Batman and Robin's costumes resemble perfect male forms, like Greek statues. So you know what? The nipples actually make sense.
There's something about an anatomically correct rubber suit.
While Burton took inspiration from Batman comics of the mid to late 80s, in Forever, Schumacher looked back to the Silver Age, with colorful stories full of cartoonish sci-fi elements. Let's remember, the plot of Batman Forever involves Riddler and Two-Face teaming up to go on a crime spree so the Riddler can become a tech mogul and use an invention to suck the brainwaves from Gotham citizens on his secret island lair.
Batman is a comic book. It's supposed to be a comic book. It was created in 1939 to be a comic book. We made a living comic book. That's what it's supposed to be.
If you demand a serious Batman story filled with detective work and damaged murderous criminals, this is not it. But it is absolutely a certain kind of classic Batman story. While there were camp elements in Batman Forever, Batman and Robin took them much, much further. That movie revels in its exaggerated aesthetics, adding giant Grecian statues to Gotham's skyline. It proudly exists in a fantastical, artificial world. In many ways, it is a big-budget adaptation of the 1960s Adam West TV series, with celebrity stunt casting of the villain roles, pun-filled one-liners, and absurd bat accessories. Gone is any of Batman's psychological trauma. No more brooding or angst. He's a superhero who has fun being a superhero alongside his best superhero friend, Robin. When people talk about these movies, the odd assumption seems to be that they're bad because they're not serious. But why? Why does serious or dark equal better? This is the thinking of insecure dudes who need to validate their continued enjoyment of the stuff they loved as children. It's the kind of thinking that led to an actual R-rated cut of a Superman movie being released by Warner Brothers. It's easy to overlook this fact, but remember, Batman was created for kids. One of the major complaints about the Schumacher movies was that they were too gay. It was the 90s, it was a less woke time. And back then, nerd culture was way more dominated by straight white dudes. They complained that the Batman costume, with its nipples, pronounced codpiece, and shapely ass, was designed to appeal to gay men. That Robin seeming so close in age to Batman gave their partnership a strong homoerotic subtext. Plus, there are the giant statues of muscular men around Gotham, Poison Ivy's drag-inspired performance, and the general emphasis on neon and camp. And they're not wrong. Schumacher is an openly gay man, and you'd have to be blind and deaf to miss all the queer subtext and imagery. But, and I say this as one of the straight dudes who used to complain about the campiness of these movies, why is that a problem? Because look, as much as people love Batman being cool and badass and brooding and totally super heterosexual, there is and has always been a gay subtext there. Schumacher just noticed it and emphasized it. Remember back in May when the theme for this year's Met Gala was camp, and everyone on Twitter kept debating what was and was not camp? So I'm not the most qualified person on this subject, but I'm pretty sure this is camp.
I need a sign.
How about slippery when wet?
Yeah, this is definitely camp. Batman and Robin wins the Met Gala. If anything, the least effective parts of these movies are when they try to be serious and emotional. A lot of the campy superhero stuff in Batman and Robin is actually pretty effective and fun, especially the opening set piece featuring evil hockey players and Mr. Freeze's rocket ship. What works less well is the subplot about Alfred developing a terminal illness, which is played completely straight. Val Kilmer, at the time perfectly cast as Batman and more than capable of big commanding movie star performances in movies like Tombstone, Top Gun, or The Doors, is given little to do as Bruce Wayne, and delivers a fairly boring, subdued performance. He blends into the scenery while Jim Carrey devours it. Until recently, I hadn't watched these movies in at least 10 years. Last time I saw them, I hated them. They were garish and obnoxious and not the Batman I wanted to see. But now, after all the dozens of superhero movies we've consumed and digested, these have somehow improved with age. In the 90s, there was a different pressure on them. This was all we had in terms of high-profile superhero movies, and they weren't what we wanted. But now, we've had plenty of serious, faithful adaptations of the comics. Christopher Nolan made Batman movies that won fucking Academy Awards. Now we can look back on the Schumacher movies and see them for what they are. A different filmmaker's take on the character. Seriously, it's time to get over the fucking nipples. And what's nice about them is just how completely different they are from modern superhero movies, where every Batman movie we've seen since, whether by Nolan or Zack Snyder, has given us a Gotham City that looked more or less like any existing American city, especially Chicago. Schumacher gave us the fantastical gothic Gotham of the comic books. I realized that I missed a certain level of theatricality to superhero movies, like how Batman swings into scenes in perfect comic book poses, or Jim Carrey's Riddler dances through every scene like a deranged Broadway performer. Or the final shots of each movie, with the heroes running toward us in slow motion, silhouetted by the bat signal. It's impossible to imagine an MCU movie leaning into full abstract iconography to that degree. And you know what? It's cool. I like it. In the same way, I appreciate Ang Lee's Hulk more with time, although that is a better movie. Schumacher's Batman movies feel unique because they're movies that would never get made now. In this age of interconnected cinematic superhero universes, it's impossible to imagine a director getting to do such a singular, distinctive take on one of these intellectual properties. Right now, I'm going to say maybe the most controversial thing I've ever said on the internet. I'm going to get torn apart for this. And remember, I'm the guy who dared to say that plot holes don't matter and that The Last Jedi is a good movie, so here we go. Joel Schumacher has nothing to apologize for. Now, to be entirely clear, I don't think either of these movies is especially great. They're very mixed bags to me. There's stuff that works and a lot of stuff that doesn't work. But they are by no means the worst superhero movies ever. Not even close, not even the worst Batman movies. They're better than a lot of the other superhero movies we've had in the last 20 years. They're better than Daredevil or the Fantastic Four movies or Elektra. They're better than some of the X-Men movies. But now, here are my 11 favorite things about the Schumacher Batman movies. His beautiful, exaggerated, comic booky Gotham City. Jim Carrey as the Riddler. He totally gets the tone the movie is operating at, and everything from his movements to his line deliveries is kind of thrilling to watch. The old school Silver Age stories where superheroes stop villains from robbing banks and stuff like that. Like, I think it's great how Commissioner Gordon just calls Batman and says, "There's a new villain in town. He calls himself Mr. Freeze." That's fun. These are the only live-action movies that give us a proper gothic Arkham Asylum. The Riddler has a secret island lair. I love it. The way Batman's cape moves. It's so fluid and beautiful, and it feels just like it does in the comics. I like that all the villains don't die. That's one of those things that way too many superhero movies do. I genuinely love the big theatrical iconic visuals. Uma Thurman as Poison Ivy. I think she understands what the movie is better than anyone else in the cast. She's like exactly on the same page as Eartha Kitt's Catwoman from the 60s series. Elliot Goldenthal's scores. He made an entirely new set of Batman themes that are honestly more memorable than any superhero movie has had since then. And the soundtracks. They had new songs by U2 and Smashing Pumpkins, and they ruled. They had goddamn Kiss from a Rose with a music video directed by Schumacher. These were peak mid-90s movie soundtracks, and I love them. My favorite comic book writer is Grant Morrison. He's written a lot of comics, but in the late 90s, his run on JLA largely created the modern interpretation of Batman, the hyper-prepared master tactician who can defeat anyone because he's always like 100 steps ahead. He's the ultimate loner badass, even though he's on a team with a bunch of his friends. Then in 2006, Morrison began a 7-year run on Batman's main solo title, and in that run he presented his main thesis. That every version of the character, every weird story from the 50s where he wears a rainbow costume and has a rocket ship and clones himself or whatever, it all counts. It's all the same Batman. And instead of brushing the stuff we don't like under a rug and pretending it doesn't exist, we should embrace it all. And in a 2012 interview, Morrison took it even further. On the subject of Batman's latent homoeroticism, he said, "Gayness is built into Batman. I'm not using gay in the pejorative sense, but Batman is very, very gay. There's just no denying it. Obviously, as a fictional character, he's intended to be heterosexual, but the basis of the whole concept is utterly gay. I think that's why people like it. All these women fancy him and they all wear fetish clothes and jump around on rooftops to get to him. He doesn't care. He's more interested in hanging out with the old guy and the kid. So here's the writer who helped create the dark, ass-kicking modern idea of Batman, completely validating Schumacher's take, right down to the nipples and butt shots. I was a kid when I saw the Schumacher movies in theaters. At the time, I thought they were awesome. I never felt the anger older fans did toward them. But I finally had my own similar experience in 2016 watching Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice. I hated it. I truly hated it. It made me angry, as it was both a miserable slog and, in my opinion, completely misunderstood who Batman is. It was not my Batman. But this wasn't 1997 anymore, and now, a bad Batman movie didn't matter as much. This wasn't the be-all, end-all of superheroes in the mainstream. This was just one movie. We had plenty of good superhero movies, and even some good serious Batman movies. If this one sucked, whatever, we'd get another one soon enough. I didn't need to launch a fan petition against Zack Snyder or send hate mail to Warner Brothers. I could accept that this was just another version of Batman that didn't happen to be for me. But it's still valid, just like Schumacher's Batman is valid, and Adam West's Batman, and Christopher Nolan's Batman, and Bruce Timm's Batman, and Bill Finger's Batman, and Dick Sprang's Batman, and Frank Miller's Batman, and Lego Batman, and Tom King's Batman. It's like the episode of the animated series Legends of the Dark Knight, where a group of kids tell stories about what they think Batman is like, and each one is radically different in the style of various famous comic books. It's all Batman. There's no superhero as malleable as Batman. While Superman and Spider-Man tend to return to a specific, definitive interpretation, with Batman, versions as wildly different as Adam West and Christian Bale sit comfortably alongside each other. Joel Schumacher's Batman is as valid as any other. It's actually pretty fun, and I'd definitely rather rewatch one of those movies than Batman v Superman. At Comic-Con this year, there was a whole Batman exhibit at the Comic-Con Museum, displaying the various costumes, props, and vehicles from the Batman movies. Walking around the museum, I look at all the Batsuits from every era right alongside each other. The Schumacher stuff isn't shoved off into a corner, it's right there next to the stuff from the Burton movies, or the Nolan movies, or that Gotham show that I never watched. And whether intended by Warner Brothers or not, the message of the exhibit is clear. This is all Batman. Batman is all of this. He has been and will continue to be many things to many people. They all count. There's something for everyone. But there are still some fans who are so obsessed with one particular ultra-grim, ultra-serious version that they'll raise $26,000 to post ads for it around the city. Call me when there's a campaign for the Schumacher cut.
Was that over the top? I can never tell.
While I was researching and writing this video, one of the most useful sources I used was this book, The Caped Crusade, Batman and the Rise of Nerd Culture by Glenn Weldon. As you'd probably guess, it's about Batman and the rise of nerd culture. But more specifically, it's about the history of Batman through comics, TV, and movies, and how it correlates to the changing landscape of fandom. It's a really great, funny look at how we ended up in this weird place where nerd stuff dominates popular media. And you can listen to it today if you sign up for Audible.com. Audible has the largest selection of audiobooks on the planet, so you can listen to this book, or if you prefer, any other. If you sign up today at audible.com/Patrick Willems, or text the promo code Patrick Willems to 500-500, you can get your first 3 months for just $4.95 per month. That is 3 months for the price of one. And you can get a new audiobook each month. So after you listen to The Caped Crusade, choose 2 more. Again, that is audible.com/Patrick Willems, or text Patrick Willems to 500-500. This offer is only good until the end of July, so go sign up now. Listen to a book about Batman.